Thanks, Mike, for sharing your knowledge. I think it's really fascinating. We'll open the questions now, so anyone, please.
Hi, my name is Indian. I'm from Indonesia. Just curious, what is the regulation in Indonesia to do this kind of work?
That's a question I could take 2 or 3 hours to answer, but right now there is no regulation. So in 2010, the government put a moratorium on awarding salvage licenses to anybody, foreign company or local company. Before that, there was a deal where you had to set up an Indonesian company, and there was a 50-50 arrangement, and there was no interest in the artifacts whatsoever. The 50% was cash value. So they wanted you to bring it up, to sell it, and provide the 50% back to the government, hopefully back to the government. And now it's under the Department of Marine and Fisheries, so they're trying to get some new legislation in. So it was sort of promised by the end of this year. There's still no sign of that happening. But now the archaeological department in various universities are beginning to have a bit of a voice. So hopefully, in fact, part of the reason for the moratorium was this big dichotomy between treating shipwrecks as purely commercial, like a natural resource essentially, and treating them archaeologically. So there was no treatment archaeologically, and they made enough noise to get it stopped. And the unfortunate outcome of that is not saving the wrecks, it's quite the opposite. So before, you actually had some responsible commercial companies that did a full archaeological excavation and provided samples for museums. And in the case of the Belitung wreck, the whole thing ended up in a museum. So now with the moratorium, there's nothing being done. When a wreck is accidentally found by fishermen, they loot the entire wreck. So it's gone backwards.
I'd like to know the status of the more recent ships that are under the water. There was a Messagerie Maritime that was, I think it's off Katong somewhere. And then what is the status of the Repulse and the Prince of Wales? I only saw the report by the BBC recently, but I wonder whether you could propose to the governments involved.
Yeah, I'm not aware of the status of the ones in Singapore, but the Prince of Wales and the Repulse are very contentious, especially now. There's been quite a lot of press about the Chinese sending large barges and crane barges in all over Southeast Asia, Java Sea particularly, but they've also apparently done quite a bit of damage to the Repulse and the Prince of Wales, just salvaging scrap steel, which I find hard to believe is profitable, but they seem to be able to do that. Now they're not actually designated a war grave, they're sort of a war protectorate, and the UK, the only legislation they have prevents a citizen of the UK diving on it. They have no say over an Australian or a Malaysian or a Singaporean diving on it. And it's within Malaysian territorial waters. So there's very little that they can do to stop the looting. All they request is that the diving goes on, and it's a very popular dive site for the technical divers now. And they just say go down and don't touch anything. But people have found evidence of quite significant commercial salvage. There's also evidence of even fishermen trying to salvage using little homemade bombs and things to break up some of the metal. So that's in a fairly bad situation now, and some of the companies that are running the technical diving expeditions, they're trying to document it to show what's going on and trying to get some protection.
The French ship, the Messagerie Maritime, I was told that it was the Titanic of the...
I'm not familiar with it.
Oh, okay, I'll update you. I'll send you some
Thank
stuff.
you.
Good evening. My name's Jeff Watson. So what is the way forward here with wrecks of archaeological significance in Singapore waters, or perhaps the wider Southeast Asian region? What's going to happen? What should happen? What can be done? How can people like us get involved in it? Is it possible?
For a long time I would have said yes, and now I'm not quite sure. And it's a very sad situation. So I actually went out many years ago and I did my postgraduate degree. I did a PhD at NUS here, specifically so that I would preempt all the legislation which would still give commercial contracts, because no government in Southeast Asia, apart from Thailand, is willing to spend their own money on shipwreck excavation. They all farm it out. They have joint ventures. But I was hoping that they would enforce the rule that is often written but rarely enforced, to have a marine archaeologist to oversee the excavation. And I've never had to use that in anger, unfortunately. I've used it on my own projects, but I've never had to use it with anybody else. So they never brought that through. In fact, things have gone completely backwards. When I had my license to look off the waters in Malaysia, for example, I had personnel from the Museum Negara on board, actively participating, paying their own way, and learning to dive. They went out and did their own projects as well on the east coast of Malaysia. So they were getting up to a very proficient level. And then the Swarasan, the Heritage Department, was formed, and the whole Marine Archaeological Department in the National Museum was disbanded, and those guys went off to curate a car museum. So that's the sort of stuff you have to deal with. The Philippines have had a lot of good work done by one guy, Frank Godio. He got a lot of private investments from the Hilti Foundation and various others. So he, largely on his own volition, did a huge amount of archaeological work and some great books. Philippines is same as Indonesia in wanting a 50-50 deal, but in the Philippines case, 50% of the artifacts go to the museum. They're not interested in the cash. But now they've become a bit too altruistic, and they said they still want foreign investment, but nothing can be sold, nothing can leave the country. So they're looking for a philanthropist who can invest fully, leave everything there, but also pay tax, also cover insurance, and pay the divers from the Philippine Museum to go and do it, which is a bit of a big ask. So there, the same problem as Indonesia. Everything has been looted because nobody is doing an official excavation. And Indonesia, the moratorium's still on. It was 2010, it was supposed to last 5 years, it's still in place. So all these places have just gone backwards. It's very disheartening. So what we can do about it, I really don't know. I proposed to the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, which has all these levels. So underneath that is the Nalanda Srivijaya Centre, and under that is the archaeological unit, essentially representing the terrestrial archaeology in Singapore. So Singapore is fairly, let's say, wealthy and a great centre and a shipping centre. So if they could establish an Asia-wide or ASEAN-wide institute with a core group that could go out on short notice when a shipwreck is found, when it becomes public knowledge, the only way to salvage a shipwreck in Southeast Asia, to protect it, is to immediately carry out an archaeological excavation. So if they had that sort of a rapid response team ready to go and work with all the local institutes, I think that would be a start, but I haven't got that off the ground.
Assuming that seawater does contain iron-dissolving substance, would iron and certain transition metals and the group, as well as those from group 1 and 2 on the periodic table, have dissolved by now?
No, they don't dissolve, they just corrode. And they corrode in interesting ways. So I showed the cast iron pots there, the cauldrons, and they corrode together into this big reef-like mass. But the cast iron is very high in carbon, so you can actually bring up those pieces and you get the casing, which is a mold. So the original cauldron will disappear altogether, and you can inject that mold with a rubber compound, and you can get a complete replica of the original artifact from the cast iron. The wrought iron, and there's also many, many cargoes of wrought iron or combinations of the two. So the Java Sea wreck I worked on in Indonesia, that's 13th century, that had 200 tons of iron on board underneath the ceramics. The Nanhai 1 wreck, which is now on display up in China, I think it's got far more than 200 tons and is causing them a lot of trouble because they can't excavate down to the hull because all this foul-smelling, rotting iron in their cargo. So it's a very problematic thing. It's not as if you need hundreds and thousands of individual pieces to show, so if you can just get a few replica pieces like that from molds, that's probably about the best you can do.
Any update on the Flor de Lama, the mint, the scam?
Did you say scam?
A lot of money has gone into it.
A lot of money has gone into it. I think it was led by Tommy Suharto back in the early 80s, when about 5 million was apparently ploughed into it. And if you read the various reports, it's been found 6 or 7 times. Bob Marks is a famous treasure hunter that's found it. Another character, a diamond dealer, Mr. Van Centis, has found it. It's a remarkable wreck. And yet, there's a lot of research information about the fact that it was in a fleet when it struck a sandbank off Aceh and wrecked, but nobody was lost in the crew. They were all picked up by the surrounding vessels. And if they could do that, they can pick up all sorts of valuables at the same time. Also, the village chief in that adjoining settlement in Aceh became a very wealthy man, lo and behold. And of course, they've got all the divers out there regularly diving for trepang and pearl shell, mother of pearl. So they have great diving capabilities, a shallow location. So for a start, there may not actually be very much left on it, even if somebody can find it. So far, nobody has found it. As far as I'm aware, I'm pretty certain nobody has. And if they do, it's going to be a hell of a nightmare between Indonesia and Malaysia, and the poor old salvo has no chance. So I wouldn't be personally looking for it.
You said that the Thais are actually...
Who speaks?
Me. So you said the Thais are actually willing to pump in their own money to bring
Yes.
this stuff up. What's going on there? Why are they so special?
Thailand, they had the benefit, there was a group came out from Europe, I can't remember exactly which country, but then Australia came in there in the late 70s, and they worked hand in hand with the Thai Fine Arts Department doing training. And so they, as part of their training package, they also passed on the ethic that there is absolutely no way to justify combining commercial with archaeological or institutional work, which is actually great if the government is going to put in the money and protect the sites. But in reality in Southeast Asia, that is a very dangerous policy to follow. But the Thai government did put the money in. Now, the only drawback is that they've been very much reactionary, and most of the wrecks that are found in the Gulf of Thailand are Thai ships. And so again, you can't go into the archives and try and find where they are, but you can look at the statistical evidence and look for places where there's going to be a concentration. And you can go and work with the fishermen, and instead of threaten them, offer them reward, offer them the use of their vessel and their divers to come and work on the site after you found it. And then you'll be able to get a ship that is virtually intact when you start work. As it is, these guys do great work, but everything they work on has been looted, sometimes very heavily. So I had an interesting experience in Thailand in 1992 when I was taken on board a ship that sailed out of Singapore, actually, the Australia Tide, and I was employed by a dive company called DiveCon, and they had been contracted by I don't know, famous or infamous, I'm not quite sure, treasure hunter Mike Hatcher. And so we went up, and he left the port here with a crew of commercial divers who were not told what we were doing. They thought we were going to go and dive on a pipeline or an oil rig. And only when we left the port, then he had a little meeting in the galley and disclosed that he had consulted all the lawyers in Bangkok and it was completely legal, and we were going to go and excavate a wreck off Thailand. And it was 60 miles offshore, and it was in, 65 meters of water, so it was a saturation diving project. And we finished the excavation, a beautiful wreck, huge hull. You could stand up in the hull and reach up and touch the top of the bulkheads. And then 5 naval vessels came out and surrounded us, and we eventually, after much to and fro, handed over the whole cargo, and then we were escorted out of Thailand. So the only, well, not the only good thing, it's a good thing that the Thai Fine Arts Department still have all that. It's all on display in a museum in Thailand. But to my knowledge, they never went back. They never went back and did a proper archaeological excavation of the site, or at least mapping of the hull itself, which I didn't have time to do.
Hi, Mike.
In World War I, in the 1918s, the Germans came from Qingdao all over to the Indian Ocean. They wrought havoc. And sank many ships. They wanted to disrupt the food supplies and the routes, all the sea routes around here. Eventually, the Australians, HMS Sydney, fired a number of shots and managed to catch Emden. I believe you might have heard of Emden, the German warship Emden. And so Emden ran aground at the Cocos Keeling Island, which is now under the jurisdiction of Australia. Do you have any knowledge of what happened to this ship? And also they came to Penang and sank 2 ships off Penang. One was the Russian ship, which I do not know the name of, and a French one. Those 2 wrecks might have been salvaged, but do you know anything about the Emden? And these 2 ships sunk by the Emden, the German ship Emden. Thank you.
In short, no. However, you say it was a German submarine that was lost off Cocos Keeling. There has been a German submarine very recently found off, it's a group of islands in the Java Sea, and the name will come to me eventually, probably after I've left. But it was actually found by fishermen, but it was surveyed by the very beginnings of a maritime archaeological group in Indonesia, working with a university. And they've been in there. It was quite deep, about 40, 45 meters, and they've been inside the sub, which is a very dangerous thing to be doing, and found the artifacts to identify exactly which submarine it was. So I think it's the first that's been found in Indonesia. So there's work being done on that aspect. I don't know about the Cocos Keeling one. But there's also submarines near Penang, and that was the target of Mike Hatcher. That was one of his very early projects. He found a submarine there where they'd used tin as a ballast in the submarine. And here he must get great credit as a salvor, because to get to the tin, when the wreck was upright in the sediment, instead of trying to dig down and then cut it out, he dug a huge trench on one side of the submarine. Without having too much regard for war graves, he then put explosives all the way along the other side and let them all go in one blast, which rolled the submarine into the hole. And therefore he had the whole keel sitting out sideways and completely accessible for him to cut open and get the tin. Very clever, actually.
Hi, Mike. Over here.
Hi, John.
Given the amount of shipwrecks in the region, is there any suggestion that there is a pre-Temasek settlement in Singapore?
It's hard to say. I mean, the Nipa Shoal wreck is marginal. That could be a little earlier than the 14th century. The coins are on board, the thousands of coins. Some of those coins are 450 years old at the time of the loss. So it shows that the Chinese coin system, they were just used for hundreds of years anyway. But I think the coins stopped. They tried laboriously to date all those coins. They stopped sometime in the 13th century. So there's not direct physical evidence that that one was 14th, although the ceramics suggest that it was. So that's a possibility of something that could have been trading here before. But the only way you're going to actually prove that is to find things on a terrestrial site, or something that's perhaps on the Padang now. The Padang, of course, was a wonderful white sandy beach. And if you're getting that remnants of wooden planks of a small trading ship showing up in a hole in Empress Place, then you're probably going to get a whole range of small craft and maybe big ones that were just left up on the sandy beach in the Padang when it was reclaimed. That's one of the first places in Singapore that was reclaimed. So there have been some excavations there and quite a lot of material found, but they were further up towards the main road. So if you got further down, as south as you could get, then there's probably more chance of something showing up. But until you can actually get that physical evidence, as opposed to guessing from shipwrecks. The shipwrecks, we always have to look at the land sites and the documentation on trade routes to try and guess where they came from and where they're going. So we really need that terrestrial evidence. And unless you have some evidence yourself, John, anything you've got to suggest there was?
Hi, Mike. I have 2 questions. First one, National Heritage Board, I think beginning of this year, first time to best my knowledge, they have come up master plan. And the master plan, one of the keyword pop up is called archaeology. And you never seen before, I may be wrong, maybe correct me. Which my question is this underwater archaeology is part of the master plan scope? Second question, as you know, Johor Nama, Batu Sawah are all part of the whole empire and this part. And you also rightfully pointed out there are quite a number of battle fought there. Can you comment about this Johor River? What is how interesting the story can go over there?
Yeah, so the fact that this master plan has come out, so there's long been discussion of some more rigorous legislation in Singapore to deal largely with the land side, because that's very much undefined. If somebody finds something magnificent in their back garden, who does it belong to? That's not properly defined. And there's also much discussion about having some legislation for the maritime environment as well. So as far as I know, up to now, everything relies completely on the Merchant Shipping Act, which the British brought in, I think 1958 was one of the last revisions of that. And that specifically, if you read the text, it's for ships that were lost yesterday, not for a historic shipwreck. And that essentially says finders keepers. So, you know, you've got to put it with the harbour master for a certain amount of time, the receiver of wreck, leave it there, advertise it, and then if nobody claims it, then you own it. And I don't think there's any legislation yet that has negated that. And that's a pretty dangerous situation. So with respect to the Johor River, there's all sorts of stories, and I don't know, some of them are fact and some are legend, but there's supposed to be treasure ships that went down in the Johor River. The drawback is that the capital shifted up and down the river, and especially when the Europeans started to come in, and they'd go up there with all their cannons on either side of the ship, and they'd just completely destroy the wooden palisades they had in the forts. They were all just wood, essentially, and earthen banks. And so they kept moving the capital further up so that the draft of the European vessels was too much for them to reach. So it shifted all the time, but the river also shifted. So if you're getting a nice archaeologically important or commercially important vessel, it could be underneath a rice field or an oil palm plantation now. So it's very difficult to work up there, and also there's no chance of getting any legislation, any permit right now. A little frustrating.
Hi, Tan here. So my question is, to verify all the ships that you found, you need to go through the information, like in The Hague, you go to the VOC records, and if it's Chinese or Japanese. So are those informations restricted, or is it easy? I could just go up to Google and say, where is that ship? You know? Yep.
No, as a rule, it's not restricted. I mean, in some libraries, there's a restriction just because the documents are so old and fragile. And so there's a group of people that are professional researchers, and they have a permit to go in, and they have special gloves, and they're allowed access to all the archives. But you'll find in places, even The Hague, which has been around for so long, they're still trying to catalogue everything. So it's like a separate treasure hunt. These guys will have to go into the archives and just go through document after document to try and track down the ship, the route, the fact that it was lost. And then quite often, when you've got these so-called treasure hunter types that are coming around raising money to go looking for a shipwreck, they'll stop right there. They'll get the manifest, they'll get the place of loss, the value of the loss, and they won't bother looking for the fact that quite often they're salvaged just after they were lost. They're very enterprising, either by the locals, who sometimes, if it was up on a reef, they just burn the ship, not for the cargo, but to get all their iron fastenings. Iron was particularly valuable for them. So that's a big drawback, and if anybody is after you for money for wreck funding, make sure you've got all the information on the potential salvage that was done after it went down. But that's the archive side. In the Dutch case, in The Hague, you've got a huge amount of material. The Portuguese is very difficult because the archives in Lisbon were actually, there was an earthquake and a fire, destroyed a massive amount of the archival material for the Portuguese. Of course, the English, you can go into Greenwich and get all sorts of information there, and you can come right up to recent, and it's in the old newspapers. So the newspapers is highly accessible. A lot of that stuff is now being put online. But if you're after something that nobody else has found, I wish you the very best of luck, because there's a lot of people, its profession is to look for the few wrecks that haven't been found by anybody in the archives.
Is the information in China or Japan easy to access, or is it even like easily available?
As far as I'm aware, and I'm not a Chinese speaker, that makes it very difficult, there isn't any central cache of information in China. So all the ships that were coming out of China generally were owned by individual merchants, or the captain himself would own it. So their company might have had, or the family might have had, but there's no central repository for all that information. And so you go through all the Chinese texts, and there's many of them, and there's many mentions of shipwreck, but there's never any detail. Whereas the European companies, they've got all sorts of detail, and they have a survivor's inquest if anyone's actually survived the wrecking. So if you can find that, and they show when they got into their boat and they rowed off in a certain direction and they looked around and saw it sinking and lined up such and such an island behind it, that's the sort of stuff you need to find. Or even a latitude and a longitude, sometimes given the depth of water. So there can be a wealth of information. But for anything that's pre-European, we're in the hands of the fishermen. And so that's why there has to be a relationship established with fishermen, so they're not going to hide the information. They're not going to be fearful of handing it over. So carrot and stick stuff. In Australia, they have legislation where anybody, a sport diver, is diving on a reef looking for a lobster, and he runs into a cannon, he can be fined for not reporting it. He doesn't have to touch it or anything. If he just doesn't report it, he can be fined for that. So that's pretty powerful. But at the same time, if he locates something of interest, he is invited to participate in the full excavation. So there's carrot and stick. So in here, I think a lot of the fishermen are not very interested in participating unless they're paid pretty well to do it, but why not? That's going to be one of the best ways of finding anything. But I fear there's less and less to find. So all the waters in Southeast Asia, they're relatively shallow until you get out to the Spratlys, that gets a little deep. South China Sea, down this way, the Java Sea is all diveable on air. And so most of that stuff has been found by the fishermen. Fishermen used to opportunistically work on this stuff if they accidentally found it. More and more are now going out there as a profession. They're deliberately looking for shipwrecks. So, and then what they're not fighting, the trawlers are damaging.
Mike, you've talked a little bit about the technical challenges of diving, but I wondered if you could talk a bit more about that in terms relative to recreational diving, and also whether that provided any prospect of accessing wrecks that couldn't have been accessed before because of technological advances in technical diving.
The technical diving now has certainly made more of a mark than it used to, so you do have more bottom time, less decompression, and access to deeper wrecks. But in the good old days, when everyone's a bit more gung-ho before this so-called tech diving was invented, and in ideal conditions, we were using double tank scuba to dive at 75 meters. And so you're not too many places in this region that are deeper than that. So there is that aspect that you certainly could go out with the modern gear. On the other hand, the local divers working out of fishing boats, and I just recently worked with some over in Sabah, still have essentially a Nilex garden hose connected to a paint compressor. And I try to convince them to bolt on a second stage regulator, but they have no interest in doing that. They just clamp it between their teeth and one wrap around their waist, and their fins are made of a piece of fiberglass with some inner tube to strap over their feet. Their masks are made with a big piece of inner tube, a flat piece of glass, and a big sort of a hose clamp around the outside. So very inventive. And they go down there and just swim around all over the place. They take the thing out of their mouth and swim around. They use it to put under a storage jar and blow it up and send it to the surface as a lift bag. And these guys dive to 70 meters. They're crazy. And a lot of them die. Indonesia, even the guys that are using the scuba gear, they come up with no tables, no decompression. They get essentially the bends, they massage each other, have a cigarette and go diving again. And feel much better, of course, when they get down. But a lot of this stuff that we're doing, that's in terms of just finding. So, but if you're going to be doing a long-term salvage project, a lot of these wrecks we actually do with commercial systems. So we're using a helmet with a hose supply from the surface. You've got a video camera on the top, a light, communication, so you can talk to it in a situation where you don't necessarily have a marine archaeologist on the bottom. You can have one up in the dive shack and they're watching the video all the time. They can instruct the diver what to do. And you record everything. And if you've got situations where those big jellyfish are drifting by, which we have had, you can go and do all your decompression in a chamber on the deck of the barge instead of having to sit in the water. Much more controlled, safer scenario.
I'll probably ask the question in a more Singaporean aspect, in the sense that, as you mentioned, there are getting less and less wrecks to discover and potentially excavate. So what is the potential for the current crop of marine archaeologists who wants to go into the profession or find out more or learn more about it? Is there a career progression for them in this industry? I mean, there are treasure hunters, there are marine archaeologists, there are pirates, if you want to call them that, who are unconventional. The question now is, has it come to a point where there are no more wrecks that are valuable or safe and valuable to excavate, so to speak? Thank you.
Yeah, so it's definitely a dwindling number of wrecks. And very few marine archaeologists. There are none in Singapore, but there's nothing for them to dive on either. So Indonesia now, there's a small group, including that one that found the German sub. So that's a quite solid beginning. Thailand, of course, have. Philippines have, to some extent. Malaysia, not so much anymore. But it's a difficult one. You'd have to be very dedicated to your calling to become a marine archaeologist. You'd have a lot of time hunting for work. On the other hand, if a few more people did it, and there was more interest shown, and they got more political power, and it's got the people behind that political power, a bit more social awareness of their underwater cultural heritage is how it's referred to. And UNESCO, of course, have got their legislation to try and protect it worldwide. The only country in Southeast Asia that signed the UNESCO Convention is Cambodia. And they did it, of course, because they have all the monuments on land. There's only been one historic wreck that I'm aware of in Cambodia, and it was found by fishermen. And then the government just got the fishermen to carry on and salvage it because they didn't have any of their own people. So nothing was recorded. They're doing a quite good job now with some external support and funding to record what was brought up, but nothing was recorded on the seabed. So on the one hand, I would discourage anybody because it's going to be hard to get a job. On the other hand, it would be fantastic if many did it and get a critical mass and get out there and change things.
Okay, last question before Mike has to decompress. Yeah.
Our seas have been plagued with pirates from times of old. Even modern day, at this time, there are pirates off Aceh, Sumatra, who attack ships. Now, in your salvaging, in your treasure hunting for bullions, what sort of safety measures have you taken to when you deal with situations when you're accosted by pirates, for example? Thank you.
Yeah, I have one example, is the Java Sea wreck. And that was, again, it was very close to Intan, halfway between Belitung and Jakarta. And we'd worked there for probably a month on a 180-foot barge, but we had a small boat bringing food, fresh food, once a week. And I suspect there'd been a little group of fishermen watching us go to and fro for a long time. And we had on board our sole protection, we have Navy personnel, one person, with a handgun. And he's as much to keep an eye on us as he is to protect us from pirates. So he was on board and he decided he wanted to go back and see his family. It wasn't pre-planned by any means, so he just jumped onto the fishing boat and was on the way back into Jakarta with a few cases of artifacts. And the fishing boat came in and I think it deployed a dinghy with an outboard engine, and that came racing in towards our resupply boat with guys on board that I think they had a parang or something. So he pulled out his little pistol and had a few shots at them, and they turned around and went back to their fishing boat and ran off. So that was purely fortuitous. That was the only time we actually had the Navy guy on our resupply boat, and it's the only instance I've had of any sort of a piracy problem. But I have certainly been very concerned about it. And when you have your barge fully laden, and we used to bring the barges back to Singapore fully laden, going at 3 or 4 knots, you're very, very vulnerable. So I certainly had it in mind. I haven't been hit just yet.
Okay, guys. Mike, thanks so much for sharing your insight and your